Greetings, friends! Juan Ingriski here, and this is the weekly Russian-Ukraine War update for the week of December 9th through December 15th of 2024. And if you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukraine War updates, be sure to subscribe to my channel. Alrighty, we're going to first talk about the South Donetsk direction, specifically in the Kharkova area. And this week, one of the fucking cauldrons has fallen, and I'm talking about the Uspenivka pocket. Now, before, in previous videos, I always talked about how there was two pockets forming in the South Donetsk direction. There is the general large-scale pocket around Kharkova, as the Russians are trying to reach the villages of Andriivka and Constantinople. And then there was a smaller pocket that was forming in the Uspenivka area that was capturing the villages of Ganivka, Vilsila High, Romanovka, gets it at this village I can't even pronounce, and Ilnivka. There was this long, elongated amount of villages that was centered around Uspenivka, where the Russians were able to start encircling it. And this week, the Uspenivka pocket has fallen, which is actually pretty rapid. And the fate of the Ukrainian troops in here is debated. Some sources are saying that they all got liquidated. Some sources are saying they escaped in the night. I do think they did escape because we would have seen a lot more of bodies in the videos. Maybe this just happened like maybe 2 days ago or so. So it is pretty new. So maybe we're still waiting for more videos. But I think it is true that the brigade that was holding the Uspenivka pocket has left. But in any case, the Russians have liquidated this pocket and have flattened the front line with their positions in Kharkova, and now have a good positions to keep marching northwards towards the Andriivka, Constantinople defense line for the Ukrainians. So what happened? Well, basically, the Russians just slowly but surely, again, this is how all these things happen, is that slowly but surely the defenses are just slowly constricted until they can no longer support defenses. So, for example, we saw this, where, the Ukrainians were trying to hold on to Ilniivka, but then the Russians did some sort of breakthrough into the village of Romanovka, and then, suddenly the Russians were also, on the outskirts here, and so, there was almost very little areas to escape. So Ilniivka fell to the Russians very easily, while as if it was a direct assault from Antonovka, it would have taken a lot longer. Same thing happened in this village that cannot be pronounced. The Russians did a big attack and landed in the village of Vasila High, in this village, and then, suddenly, and with the attack in Romanovka, suddenly the Ukrainians that were trying to defend their positions in here were surrounded, and they're like, oh shit, we can't defend this anymore. So, while as a direct assault on this village would have taken forever, now since the Russians cut off their lines of retreat, they had to give it up pretty fast. And then, the same thing happened in Ganivka, and the Russians did a big attack in Uspenivka and occupied, these agricultural buildings, this post office, and basically have cut off Ganivka. And the Russians basically then stormed it and liquidated. And there was actually a big pocket here. The Russians were surrounding it on all sides, and then they probably did a breakthrough towards these fields here. But yeah, then Ganivka fell. And what's most interesting is that then also after that, the Russians then took full control of the village of Uspenivka. And we actually have also geolocated footage of this fortified area in the north of Uspenivka being fired on by the Ukrainians. So the Russians have taken control of this area right here. And so this Uspenivka pocket has fallen. Right now, the only thing that's a bit of an unknown is the situation in this southern part of the Sukila Yar River, the village of Constantinople. Sources are saying the Russians are battling for this village. I think the Russians have taken this village, or at least probably are still clearing it up. But there's no way to support this village anymore, and there's no purpose to holding it anymore. Before, holding Constantinople for the Ukrainians meant that they had at least one line of retreat for the Ukrainians in this area, but now it's like literally just a death sentence on the other side of the river. So I'm expecting them to retreat from this village towards these fields here to try to support Dachina, which is where the Ukrainians are trying to hold on so that they could keep the supply lines to this Kharkova power plant alive. So, so I'm pretty certain that probably the Russians will take Constantinople and everything to the south of this river this week, if they have not already done so. In fact, we're actually getting some more sources saying that the Russians are already advancing northwards and are trying to have reached the outskirts of the village of Zelenivka here, which makes sense. So the Russians are going to start trying to move northwards here and try to reach the villages of Rozolovka and Zelenivka. If they could do that, then they could put under visual control this highway, and then they could do a direct attack to take it. The Ukrainians escaped one pocket, but if the Russians could develop their offensive in the northern area here and start coming down from the south here, from the north here towards Andriivka, then they're going to start. The Ukrainians that are in this area are going to start finding themselves in a pocket as well. So, lots of big things happening in this Uspenivka pocket collapsing, and now we shall see how the Russians continue advancing northwards to try to take Karakova itself. Alrighty. Speaking of Karakova, the Russians the Ukrainians are slowly backing away from it, and kind of surprising because I thought the Ukrainians would try to hold on to Karakova for symbolic purposes, but they're falling back from very strong defensive positions in Karakova, and so it's pretty interesting how maybe they know that since the Russian, after they took Starterny, one road of supply was cut off, and now there's only literally one highway that connects Karakova to supply, and it's under fire control. So, maybe they're trying to slowly and surely just slowly give things up and slowly back off. Because we know where this Karakova pocket's going to end up. The Uspenivka pocket fell, and then the Karakova pocket's going to fall very soon. And what's gonna happen is that this front line's gonna basically with Velika Novosovka is gonna basically flatten, and then I think it's gonna stop. I think the Russians will then focus somewhere else. I don't think the Russians will keep marching northwards. I don't think. Again, this is just my read on the situation. Right now, the Russians are able to advance here because after the breakthrough in the Pokrovsk direction, they were able to surround the South Donetsk direction from the north, and then also after the capture of Ugledar, they were able to expand northwards and slowly but surely start putting the squeeze on Karakova. So basically, those two events, the breakthrough after Ugledar and the breakthrough in Pokrovsk, basically ensure that the Russians will be able to close this pocket. It was it's a outcome that came about through a couple of during the fall campaigns to capture Ugledar and the breakthrough towards Pokrovsk. But it's now all the gains of that are now coming to fruition, but then after that, then the Russians will have their front line flattened, and the Ukrainians won't be in danger of being encircled anymore. So they'll be able to hold on to defenses a lot easier, and it'll be a lot harder for the Russians to keep pushing. But I could definitely see the front line, kind of flattening in this point. This Karakova pocket will be taken, probably by January or something. And then from there, the Russians will stop and then probably focus on Pokrovsk. But yeah, so speaking of Karakova, we have the Russians raising their flags in the Karakova, what do you say? The Karakova City Hall, and we are basically this. You could see there's a bunch of high-rise buildings area here, and the Russians are slowly but surely pushing through here. A lot of pro-Russian sources are saying they're pushing along this and capturing this fish farm here. And basically what sources are saying is that the only things that are left for the Russians to clear are the most western area of the high-rise building area. But basically everything in the center here of the high-rise buildings have been taken by the Russians. We actually have geolocated footage of the Russians being in this center part here. So the Ukrainians are falling back towards this power plant. So the Ukrainians are going to try to hold on to the power plant for as long as possible. But this is the last part of Karakova that they need to take. But with the Russians can move from Starterny towards the south here, and they could easily just cut this. Or if the Russians move towards Andriivka from the north, they could cut the supply of Karakova from this area, and then if the Russians keep moving northwards, they could cut it from the south. So it's going to be very the Ukrainians are basically holding on to this until if the flanks sag and the Russians are able to push towards Andriivka and Constantinople, then they'll retreat towards Andriivka and Constantinople here. So, yeah, Karakova, the center of Karakova has fallen, and now just the power plant is left. There are still some buildings in the more western part of Karakova, but the Russians are going to basically be able to hold to Karakova very soon. And then let's finish off with the South Donetsk direction by talking about Velika Novoslovka. Um, this week, the Russians are there's been a slowdown in operations in Velika Novoslovka, but there is some things that we talked about here. The biggest thing is that the Russians are pushing in the fields to the west of Liquidated. So obviously, since this is a river, the things on the sides have a higher high ground than obviously these villages on the river. And so the Russians are moving around the village of Romanopil and have taken these fields here. And as the Russians are expanding and trying to take more of these fields here, and they're not only are they reaching one of the last supply roads that support Velika Novoslovka, they're putting in danger the Ukrainians that are in the village of Makarovka and the village of Starzhenevia, these two villages. And I wouldn't be surprised if, since the Russians have taken Bogdanovka, and if the Russians are able to hold on to their gains in the fields here, that they're able to take these two villages and then force the Ukrainians and flatten the front line here, and then force the Ukrainians to defend Vermivka and Neshchernutska here, and try to, and as that happens, the Russians will keep moving towards this road. And the defenses in the western part of Liquidated are, the Russians are slowly but surely putting the squeeze there. The Russians have also flattened the front line here. They have captured more of these fields to the south of Liquidated, so the Ukrainians fell back to the southern part of Liquidated itself, and the fields are now under Russian control. Some sources are saying the Russians have withdrawn from this area from Liquidated and retreated back to these farms right here, which makes sense. So right now the Russians are basically slowly but surely putting the building blocks together to storm Velika Novoslovka. As we saw with the Uspenivka pocket, slowly but surely, every advance of the Russians made life a lot harder for the defenders of the Ukrainians in those villages until eventually they collapsed. And that's what's happening in Velika Novoslovka. The Russians are right on the eastern outskirts. They are in the southern outskirts. They are approaching the west. The Russians here, they're approaching from the north. And this week, and in the northern part of Velika Novoslovka, it's basically the battles of counterattacks. And what I mean by that is that, the Ukrainians were counterattacking the Russians in Rostovivka, but the Russians were holding on to that. And by the end of this week, we actually have some pro-Russian sources and pro-Ukrainian sources saying the Russians did another major attack and reached the village of Novokomar again, and are now battling for this town. Now, the main goal for the Russians, obviously, is to basically secure Novokomar again and try and hold off the Ukrainians from being able to take it back. If they could hold on to Novokomar, and if we look at the global scope, in the big picture, and the Russians continue advancing in these fields and manage to capture this road here, and then the Russians are in the Novokomar, well then at this point we can see how all the roads are physically cut, and the only way for the Ukrainians to leave is through these fields. And then the Russians will then storm it from the east, from the north, from the south, and then then the Russians will also try to storm these two villages in the west of Velika Novoslovka. So Velika Novoslovka is getting prepped to be stormed. I wouldn't be surprised if Velika Novoslovka is taken by maybe mid-January or something, maybe in a month or so, maybe even closer than that. It depends on if they're able to secure Novokomar. So yeah, that's the South Donetsk direction. A lot of big changes. There's been no changes in the Zaporozhye or Kherson directions. Alrighty, now let's talk about the Pokrovsk direction, which is also another very interesting area, and this is where a lot of the big updates are happening as well. Before when we talked about the Pokrovsk direction, we always talked about the southern part, but this week there's actually not been much in the southern part. Right now, in terms of the southern part of the Pokrovsk direction, the only thing that's big is that the Russians are trying to hold on to their gains in Starzhenevka and Uspenivka and are clearing this kind of pocket that is between these, and the Ukrainians are probably slowly falling back towards Solonovka, Petropovka, and Shevchenko, and probably also towards Dachnia. So they're trying to retreat from this pocket and hold on to this position so that they could defend the supply lines towards Karakova here. But besides some clearing these fields, there's not been really much changes. Where it is interesting in the Pokrovsk direction is actually towards Pokrovsk. This week, the Ukrainian defense, we talked about how last week the defenses of the Ukrainians collapsed in Pokrovsk, and this week that continued. However, now this week, the Ukrainians are trying to rectify this and are trying to do counterattacks. So this week, the biggest news is the complete fall of the village of Shevchenko, this village right here. This is actually a town of about 1,500 people. So it's a pretty big village, a big town, and what happened here is that apparently all the Ukrainians that were defending the southern part of Pokrovsk basically collapsed and had to withdraw, and um, and so they were able to actually take Shevchenko without pretty much a very slow, without really a big fight. I thought Shevchenko would take a long time to take, but the Russians were able to take this very much intact. And we actually have geolocated footage, at least in the western part of Shevchenko, of the Russians being here. We don't have any geolocated footage here, but we pretty much have. Most sources are saying they have fully taken it, and a lot of some pro-Russian sources are saying they advanced so much towards this rail line right here. However, and then they also have taken more of these fields and are also advancing towards these line of defenses here. The Russians have captured the village of Novitrud, this village right here. They're obviously advancing along this rail line. The Russians have captured the farms of Dachinska, and while there's not been any confirmation yet, I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians have fully captured the village of Dachinska, this village right here. And also, we have geolocated footage of the Russians being in the southern part of Liquidated in this area right here. And I wouldn't be surprised if also the Russians take the southern part of Liquidated. So there's this kind of these villages are divided by a bunch of the Solonovka River and this water reservoir here. And so everything to the south of here, Dachinska, Novitrud, and the southern part of Liquidated is getting battled over. And I wouldn't be surprised if by the end of next week, the Russians have taken everything to the south here. And obviously then the Russians will continue moving along this rail line to try to take the village of Ukrainka, advance along here. And then if they could do this and capture this here, then they could take the village of Zelania and then the northern part of Listovka. And then they could hold, and then if you look here, what happens if they're able to take these villages is that they're able to flatten the front line with their positions in Novigorivka and with Pokrovsk. So the biggest thing about Shevchenko is that not only does it allow them to fly in the east here, this opens up the positions to advance to Pokrovsk to the west here. And Shevchenko was supposed to defend the western defenses of Pokrovsk, but that fell. So the Ukrainians retreated towards Pishania, Zerania, and these areas right here. And if the Russians could take these three villages, then it's just there's nothing stopping them from starting to cut the highways and railroads to supply Pokrovsk. However, and also this week, the Russians have completely captured the village of Novotoretska. We actually have multiple geolocated footage of the Russians being here. So the village of Novotoretska has fallen to the Russians. This is another big game, and this basically anchors them to start advancing to the south towards the village of Novolenovka and Ukrainka here. Now, the thing about this is that when I talked about earlier about with all these Russian gains in the southern part of Pokrovsk, the Pokrovsk southern defenses have crumbled. However, the Ukrainians are not letting this stop. They're trying to let this stop. So they're sending troops here, and they're actually doing counterattacks. We actually had a counterattack towards Novotoretska, but it was repelled. And then we had a counterattack happening towards Shevchenko. And apparently, according to some sources, they actually entered Shevchenko, but then they got repelled. So there's actually counterattacks happening right now. So it could vary. Since the Russians just took this, they don't have strong positions here, right? So it might be very much possible that the Ukrainians lose. How do you say it? That the Russians lose these positions if the Ukrainian counterattacks are very fierce and they're able to retake it and shit. So if they're able to do that, then obviously if they can retake Shevchenko, then that will obviously help the Pokrovsk. But we shall see if the Russians are able to hold on to their gains in Shevchenko and Novotoretska. Also in the Pokrovsk direction here, the Russians are continuously moving towards these villages of Yasenovka, Ukrainka, and Novolenovka. The Russians have captured more fields to the north of Pishumka, also captured more areas to the south of it, and we actually have some confirmation that the village of Pishumka has fallen to the Russians. And so I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians storm Ukrainka and Novolenovka, try to take these two villages, and just kind of more push the front line more and more to the west. And then from here, they could then try to storm to the south here. Maybe take Yasenovka and try to reach here. and then from here they could then start, pouring down towards, the Andreevka here, and yeah, and so yeah, so the Russians in Pokrovsk are doing very well, and then there's actually been some changes in this direction near Minigrad. We actually have some geolocated footage that the Russians have taken this area to the west of Krasnoyar and Mykolaievka. This area right here was getting droned by the Ukrainians, so this will definitely help the Russians a lot. And what the Russians will probably try to do is, move, have position along this rail line here, and then probably try to storm the village of Sukla Yar, and try to hold on here. And so this gives them a better position to start storming Minigrad in the foreseeable future here. So yeah, that's the Pokrovsk direction. The Russians have made big gains in the southern part of Pokrovsk, and but now the Ukrainians are fighting back, and we shall see if the Russians are able to hold on, and not only that, expand and continue their gains here. Alrighty, now we are going to go to the Terets direction, and last week Terets was in the big news here because the Russians have fully secured the village of Terets by taking over these mine shafts here, these terracons, the center part of Terets. And this week the Russians have, we basically have we have more geolocated confirmation of the Russians in central Terets. We saw them raising their flags, and not raising their flags, but basically we have more geolocated footage of the Russians being here, and basically they're consolidating their positions in this central part here. And so they took this, they're consolidating, and now they are pushing towards the northern residential area. We have some geolocated footage of the Russians being in this area right here, but I wouldn't be surprised if they're now taking more and more of this residential area. The Russians are also captured this residential area right here. And so the Russians are slowly but surely pushing towards this small little terracon here, so the Ukrainians have these small little areas of defense here, but this shouldn't stop the Russians. The Russians should be able to take this area pretty easily. However, the last big line of defense for Terets is this mine shaft right here, and this is where the Ukrainians are trying to hold on to their positions. And so this helps secure kind of the more northern, the more eastern part of Terets. Or not eastern, like northeastern part of Terets, but so the Russians are going to slowly but surely try to encircle this little mine shaft. But if this mine shaft falls, which is the last big defense line, or big defense node, sorry, I'm tired. Then Terets is going to fall. But I'm pretty certain Terets will probably fall within the 2 or 3 weeks or so. But after their main defenses collapsed. But yeah, so Terets, the Russians, after they took the main central, the mine shaft and the central, the high-rise buildings area, they're going to be slowly but surely moving, probably advancing in these fields here, try to take these fields, and but basically slowly try to encircle this mine shaft and then move this way to try to take this northern area here. Alrighty, that's the Terets direction. The Russians are now putting the final push towards taking it. And now let us go to the Chasiv Yar direction. This week, there's basically the main thing is the Russians managed to take this factory, but then the Ukrainians did a counterattack and took more positions in this factory. So Chasiv Yar, big clashes in the on this factory. So just back and forths. It keeps it. Just this factory is basically the main node of defense for the Ukrainians in Chasiv Yar. So it's holding on very much. The Ukrainians are trying to hold on to the Russians trying to capture it, and so if the Russians capture this, then it's going to be a very big blow to the Ukrainian defenses in Chasiv Yar. Alrighty. In the Seversk direction, there's been no changes. The only big change to talk about in the Seversk direction is that we actually have geolocated footage that the Ukrainians are still in the village of Bilogorivka. So, all these talks that the Russians were in Shevchenko, Grigorivka, Bilogorivka were for naught. The Russians are, the Ukrainians are still getting droned here. This place is a shattered moonscape. I wouldn't be surprised if Bilogorivka was wiped off the map. But yeah, besides that, nothing else in the Seversk direction. There's also been no changes in the Le Mans direction. However, where there's actually been some very interesting changes, it is in the Kupiansk direction. So let's talk about what's happening in the Kupiansk direction. So in the Kupiansk direction, one of the biggest changes this week is that the Russians have completely captured, or at least mostly captured, the village of Lazova. Accordingly to some sources, so we talked about how the Russians managed to clear a lot of these fields between Berestova, south of Pashana, east of Kruglatovka, and this week the Russians managed to break into the village of Lazova and capture the northern and central part of it. They say the southern part is still under Ukrainian control, but I wouldn't be surprised if that area was also captured by the Russians, and the Russians completely captured the village of Lazova. So this is just another stepping stone for the Russians to continue, improving, making their kind of, what they're trying to do basically is take all these villages to the north of Borova, and then from here they'll have a very strong area here to push in every direction. Because right now they only have a small area here, and if the Ukrainians do a big counterattack, they could try to split this small little salient here. However, they make this a bigger salient, it'll be a lot harder to destroy the Russian gains in splitting the Oskol defenses in half. So the Russians are slowly but surely pushing here, and Lazova was another place they just took. A lot more sources are also saying they have captured more areas to the north of Zelenia Hall, and I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians take this small little village here. And so we might be seeing basically by the end of next week the Russians take fully Lazova and Zelenia Hall. And then what's going to happen here is, right now the Russians are battling for Zerozhanova, and the Russians are going to push, along this reservoir, and then they're going to push, along this reservoir here, and basically, flatten here, maybe take the village of Borsova and Drivka here. And then from here, the Russians will then move towards Novokruglatovka and try to battle for the village of Budoslavka here. And from here, since the Russians are about to cut off their line of retreat, the Ukrainians are going to fall back from Zaradovka, and the Russians are going to push from the south here. And then the Russians will then take Bolshavka, and then the Ukrainians are going to fall back to Novoplatanovka here. So at this point, the Russians will then have something like this. They'll keep pushing south, and then they'll also try to push towards the villages, towards south here to cut off Novoplatanovka. And then at the same time, I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians push to the south here, try to cut off this road, and flatten the front line with Kopany. And then they're basically making themselves in position to start encircling Borova and try to storm this town here. So they're slowly but surely the Russians are pushing. They have captured Lazova. They are battling for Zelenia Hall. They're probably going to secure this by the end of next week and continue their positions to reach Borova. And then in the northern part of Kupiansk, some Ukrainian sources say they pushed the Russians out of Klostanovka, but pro-Russian sources say that is not true. So this source says it's true, but we need to get more geolocated footage for that. But if that is the case, then the Russians are trying to hold on to Klostanovka as much as they can, and this just shows that the Ukrainians are trying to cut off this bridgehead here. But we need more geolocated footage to see if the Russians actually have been pushed out of Klostanovka here. And then in the northern part here, this is the most interesting part, is that apparently, the bridgehead in Dorichnia is still true. The Russians apparently still have positions on the side. I thought this was just a fake Ukrainian thing. But apparently, according to some pro-Russian sources, the Russians have entered the southern part of Dorichnia and have captured this area right here, in Rokogovko here. And so apparently the Russians have now entered the village of this town of Dorichnia, and are now battling, trying to secure their bridgehead here. So apparently it's actually true, but we don't have any geolocated footage, so we need to. I'm still kind of skeptical that there is a bridgehead here. So we shall see if they could, if they're able to capture Dorichnia, but I have my doubts. Alrighty, that is the Kupiansk direction. A lot of interesting things happening there. There's been no changes in the Kharkov direction. And then now let's talk about Kursk, where a few things of note have happened here. So in Kursk, the main thing that's happening this week again is mostly in, well, pretty much everywhere. So last week the Russians captured the village of Plednokonovko, and they're now expanding their positions in the south of Suchka. So this week, right now, the Russians are battling for the village of Cherkassky Konovko here, and so I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians are able to take this small village. And then, because the Ukrainians have a lot better positions to the south of Suchka, this area, so the Russians will try to flatten finally Rushka, Konopka, and Cherkassky Konopka, and the Ukrainians will fall back to these villages here to secure southern Suchka. And then another thing that's interesting is the Russians have actually entered Sumy for the first time and have taken this forest to the south here. This is probably just to secure their gains in the south here. It's not like they're prevented from advancing in the fields here. But what's interesting is that what the Russians could actually do, what I think might actually happen, is that you could see the Pesi River here, right? So we see the Pesi River go here. And what's interesting, what I think the Russians might do, is they might advance towards the village of Alexandrivka and then towards the village of Mironopolivia here. And then, advance along this pesky river. And then from here, what they could do is they could then advance from here and then kind of take this entire area of Sumy and then have something like this. And then this will give, this would, eliminate the small bridgehead that Sumy has into Kursk. And then from here, they could then advance in these fields of in southern Kursk here, so that they could continue liberating Kursk from the Ukrainians. So it's actually interesting that the Russians have entered Sumy, and we'll see if this obviously is just to improve their positioning so that they could have a better defense. Could flatten the front line, could actually expand, how do you say it? Just so they could have a better position to take Kursk. I think the Russians are just trying to push the Ukrainians out of Kursk. They're not trying to take anything in Sumy that they don't need to, but they will if it helps them take Kursk back. Also, in the more northern direction here, the Russians have completely captured the village of Novononovka here, and where a lot of the battles are going on is this Ukrainian position in Kurchanovko. Accordingly, there was some big push toward. Apparently, North Koreans have entered the fray and are battling for this kind of tree line right here, but it's not completely confirmed. It's just another Ukrainian hearsay. We still don't have actual confirmation of that happening, but we shall see. But we do know that the Ukrainians are in Krotyanovko, and this is where the Ukrainians are trying to hold off the Russians from breaking through here. Because obviously the Russians want to eliminate this kind of salient here, and then eliminate this northern pocket, so that they could then move towards the northern part of Suchka. And also the Russians are pushing towards the village of Ruska Pernovko. Currently, apparently they've taken more tree lines around to the north of Ruska Pernovsky, so just some more little advancements there. So yeah, some advances for the Russians in Suchka in the Kursk direction. So, but slow, steady gains. Alrighty, that is the end of this video. Hope you guys enjoyed this weekly update for the Russian-Ukraine war update. Be sure to subscribe to my channel if you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukraine war updates. Like this video, comment your thoughts, comment what you think this war is going to, what's happening in this war, and share this video around. So aim high and wonder on.